Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of the Testing Peers podcast. Tonight, we are going to be talking about presentation styles and presentations and where things have gone well and probably where things have gone wrong as well. We have semi-regular co-host Dermot with us tonight.
Hello, everyone.
And then we have the usual suspects of Russell.
Hello.
And Chris.
Hey, hey.
And myself, David. Hello. We'd like to thank our sponsors, and Dermot would like to share the sponsor message.
I'd love to. Saffron QA continue to be our sponsor, and they are also here to support the testing community. Therefore, should any of our listeners be in the market for a new job in testing or hiring new talent for your team, please reach out to Ben. He can be contacted via email at ben@saffronqa.co.uk.
So professionally done. Thank you, Dermot. And so we're going to talk about presentations, but first, as always, we're going to have banter. And we've got the king of banter, Chris.
Gosh, got a promotion. That's exciting. So we're sort of into a mixture now, listener, in sort of summertime where people are thinking of holidays, but also thinking of attending conferences, which is a little bit on theme for later. So I thought I'd maybe ask you folks to think back to the first time you travelled for work. Was it glamorous? Did you think it was glamorous? Where did you go? What did you experience? What was that like?
Wow, I just went back through the first time. Oh no, it wasn't the first time. The first time was, oh no, that wasn't the first time either. The first time was just tripping through my previous employments. So the official first time I traveled for work was when I was working for Sun Microsystems, and they needed me over in the headquarters in Menlo Park. Not the headquarters, the campus. Headquarters was in San Jose, I think. Sun Microsystems campus is now the Facebook campus. So if you go looking on Google Maps, you'll probably find it. It was very exciting because I'd never been on a multinational campus before, and I hadn't really spent much time in San Francisco Bay Area. But it was over my birthday, and for much of the week I was on my own. So it was a bit bleak, which was weird. So it kind of had the two things going. It was like an excitement of work travel for the first time, and it's my birthday and I'm not at home.
It's a really good question, and I'm trying to think back, and I actually don't know the first one, but I can roughly figure out it was one of a few, if that makes sense. So before software, I worked in other worlds, charity education. I looked after the sort of southwest of the UK, sort of exam boards for vocational sort of side of things. So I would travel for work there. So I'd travel down from Newcastle to Birmingham, quite probably. It was almost certainly Birmingham the first place I went, but I can't actually remember. So I probably went to like a school in Dudley or something like that. And it would be exciting as getting on a train and having no idea where I was going and getting off at the other end and just hoping and praying. And then probably getting a train back the same day, or maybe crashing in a hotel. But I think it was the same day sort of trip the first time. But it wasn't anything exciting, if I'm honest with you. It certainly didn't make me go, wow, I want to travel for work.
You've reminded me, actually, that I was a bit like Dermot and going back in my time and thinking, oh, that was, no, actually, there's time before that. And so in a previous life, I was a teacher, and I remember, does it count as working with work? So I traveled with kids to various places, including they were doing a physics. It wasn't really a competition, but it was to do with physics. So we worked with a sugar beet factory in Norfolk. And so the trip would be to the sugar beet factory. We had a tour of the sugar beet factory, and then we worked on a particular engineering problem for them doing the sugar beet factory. And so, yeah, so it wasn't that glamorous. And there was a lot of health and safety and lots of things to sign as part of that to make sure that no one was harmed whilst walking around a working factory with a big drum drying all the sugar beet. Yeah, so that was probably one of the first. I probably went to other schools, but that's probably the most memorable and one of the earliest ones.
I was thinking about this after I asked the question, like a genius.
It's always
And
the best way.
always a good one. And I think the first time I actually travelled for work was to Newbury. What would that be? Berkshire. Just down the road from Reading. Went to a tool vendor's free training day on some of their tools. Had to stay overnight in a hotel with a couple of colleagues that I'd never spent any time with. Yeah, I thought, oh, travel with work, that's pretty cool, isn't it? That's quite exciting. You next going somewhere, you stay in a hotel, you get to use expenses. Man, that wears off quickly, doesn't it? There you go. I mean, that's fun. I think one of the next times I travel with work, I believe David handed his notice in at work that same day, and I was traveling with our boss. So that was awkward. I did tell him he shouldn't hand it in whilst I was with them, but unfortunately he did. He didn't want to wait to leave.
For a moment, I thought you were going to say that traveling with David made him resign.
It could do, yeah, but no.
Ruined the trip and build a bit of the conversation on the way there.
It's always good to hear other people complain about your friends.
Yeah.
You can't beat it, really.
It's not possible with us lot, though, surely, said Chris. Not possible.
No, gosh, no. Yeah, on that note, that was fun. Nice little trip down memory lane for us all. Maybe slightly traumatizing. Yeah, presentation styles. We had a little look, listener. We weren't quite sure what we were going to be talking about today. And we looked in our fabled Trello board that, quite frankly, we haven't updated since February last year. Presentation styles came up, and we thought, oh, that's interesting. That's relevant, not just for conferences. We do a lot of presenting at work. We run a lot of meetings, and we also observe a lot of people presenting, especially in these remote times, right? Anyone got any thoughts they want to kick us off with?
So many. At some point, I think we should mention the Microsoft-shaped elephant in the room that is PowerPoint. That has kind of become the weapon of choice for so much communication and presentation internally and within organizations and even outside of organizations. The benefits that has, but also when used unwisely, the inelegancies and the inefficiencies that it brings about in terms of communication. I suppose what it comes down to, whenever I've thought about it, it comes down to, for me, what is this thing being used for? Because I've been in organizations where they've used the slide deck of a presentation to convey all of the information for people who want to read afterwards, which is not what a presentation should be. They jam everything in there. I remember one time having a corporate slide deck from the C-suite, and it was chock full of text. Like they ran out of text and they had to squeeze the last 2 points into a smaller face in order to get it to fit into the slide. So yeah, that's probably the way that you don't go. Personally, I tend to favor the other end, where you just kind of go for the punchiest message first, probably even with a cat picture.
I think you're right. Let's get PowerPoint out of the way, first of all. I think that for me, it's consistency. People who are not experienced in giving presentations look at PowerPoint and go, oh, look at all these fancy animations and just cram it all into one presentation and have them all whizzing around. And that just turns out to be annoying after a while. Absolutely, death by 100 PowerPoint presentations into a 10-minute presentation, is just difficult. I think that for me personally, and I think you mentioned it, Dermot, simplicity. So key points, cat pictures, or any pictures are useful, and then supporting it with verbal. That's my take, because then it caters for people who want to read a bit and are more things, those visual people who listen to it and take in on board the visual element with it, as long as it's relevant. Right? I know cat pictures are always relevant, and then those people that are more oral, who listened to what you're actually saying. So that is my take on it. So therefore, you don't have to concentrate on the reading, especially for those people that struggle with it and may not necessarily be their first language or whatever. The other thing is it has to be relevant to the audience. If you are passing across technical stuff, you may have a bit more information on board on the actual pages than if you're just doing an informational thing. But it needs to be relevant and correct for the audience.
There's this area of research as well called multi-sensory learning, which I've only seen research applied to kids, but it does apply to a certain extent to grown-ups as well. So the idea that you can convey an idea more effectively if you incorporate all the senses rather than just the one. So, rather than droning monotonously against a high text background, make that engaging. Talk to them with modulated voice because it's appealing to the ears. Use visual stimuli like cat pictures, that kind of thing.
It is interesting because it does, to David's point, depend on the audience, what you're trying to convey. Like if you're trying to convey how to do something, I don't know, with Playwright, for example, then a picture of a cat probably is a bit of a hard way to get that information across. But 300 lines of code on a PowerPoint one slide is also going to be a very bad way of getting that same information across.
Mhm.
And it is about adapting to the audience and the purpose. I've seen what you've seen as well, Dermot, which is kind of PowerPoint presentations becoming decks to be sent around versus a presentation. I kind of get it. It's kind of like replace the Word document type logic of doing certain things, but that's not a presentation in the sense anymore. It's now, I don't know what to call it.
Yeah, because it's not a document.
Yeah, it's not a document, but neither is it a presentation to be delivered.
Mhm.
I much rather send a video of someone presenting that because there's context to go with it. And I think there is an art of doing that. And I think presentation gives you so much more sort of tacticity with what you get. You can understand what to emphasize, what not to. A dry deck, and I complain about this a lot where I work in other places, it's just too much text on screen half the time. It's actually should be a Word document sometimes. They just like the way that it's horizontal versus vertical. Things like that seems to be the key wins for them. It's like, I do not need to read 300 lines on one piece of a slide. That is not what I want to get. I need to have it less written. If it's just written and reading, yes, create a document. Create a Confluence page, perhaps present it that way to me. But don't give me a PowerPoint deck. That annoys me.
There is a way to do it though. That has to be the shareable item. So for example, when you're speaking at a conference, you're going to run through a bunch of concepts. You might have references to backup data that you really couldn't get into too much detail because it wasn't necessarily the thrust of your talk, but you can put that stuff into the notes. So if somebody like you can say, if you want references, if you want the information that I spoke about, you can look at the slide deck and there'll be like a URL or something, or, a citation to a paper that you can throw in the notes and they'll be able to follow it up.
Another thing I've done before is hide the slides. So therefore you may include certain extra information that isn't in the presentation, but then hide it and then share it and go, look, there is extra information there. The worst thing you can do, I think, is again, have those 100 slides and go through every one and go, there's some information on, hide them. If they're not relevant to the presentation, hide them. You can always share it and go, there is more information, but I've only got time to go through this amount. Don't rush them through because otherwise people question exactly what's happening.
And don't read them out either because the audience can usually read what's on the screen.
Your narrative should expand on what's written, not just regurgitate what's written.
Or even counterpoint it.
Yeah, conflict with it's quite a good one. I must admit, I've gone to a trend. I don't know whether it's a good trend or a bad one of using quotes from other people as talking points, as kind of key things, just to kind of reference something, but to get people thinking. And then you talk around the quote. You don't read the quote necessarily. You can, but you talk around it about what the quote's trying to get to, almost for want of a better way. But it's a good way of making people engage their eyes, their visual senses, and their brain, as well, rather than just sitting passively, but not making it dull, making it something slightly more exciting. And by this, I don't mean 300 line quotes again. It's kind of, 20 words. Anything more than that's a bit too much.
It all reminds me of Chris's favorite word to throw into any of these discussions, which is context.
Chris hates context.
I was going to say something else is that if you're not used to presenting, because I think we're all experienced in certain aspects of presenting, and as leaders we had to present at different context, meetings, department, and to clients, etc., and conferences and stuff. If you're starting out, control what you feel you can control. If you are in a department meeting and usually the group lead or your line manager is in charge of the slide deck, there's no reason why you can't take responsibility for your slides. So therefore you're not constantly asking, next slide, please. Next slide, please. Oh no, you can then you are in control of the speed that you're delivering it. It takes a bit of confidence to put it into someone else's hands because you might stumble. So keep as much control as is possible by sharing your own slides. So therefore you are then more comfortable in actually delivering it.
It's a good point, because saying next slide, I find irritating when I'm doing it. And I know as an audience member, recently seeing a talk like that, it detracts and it disengages.
And also puts you off as a speaker. So if you're actually having to think of that, it's a bit like driving a car. If you have to think about constantly giving a narrative, then actually it can detract and put you off from what you're actually saying. So keep as much control as you can.
I was thinking a little bit about how presenting is it's very different, and people will approach it differently to each other. Like we've touched upon how some folks want to go by script, some people want to have just prompts, and then how you're in different parts. And I think that can often be the way sometimes people approach music, and sometimes people can only play the music to the letter that they see on a script. But also sometimes people will just be able to jam and go all over the place and make some sort of beautiful thing. And I think
Omni the tune and I'll play along kind of thing.
yeah, exactly. And there's an art to those things, but ultimately, as a viewer and observer, someone in that, you want whoever's presenting to be comfortable in whichever way they're doing. If you ask me to actually write a script and then to have it done, I would lose all the energy, all the enthusiasm, any kind of life that perhaps I'd have as a presenter the minute I had to read the exact same thing for like the 10th time. It would be sort of the death knell for me, and therefore the person who would be watching me, observing me, my presentation would lose that. But I guess my point is, it's hard to even it's same with watching music, right? It's hard not to sometimes put yourselves in the place of the presenter. If things don't feel nice, kind of relaxed, like the person presenting isn't comfortable, you feel uncomfortable. And you start thinking about how would I do in this situation? What's that like? Something's not quite right here. The air of comfort in a session where there's presentations, it's quite magical. It doesn't always happen. But to be in a session where someone is presenting with comfort, I think it puts the whole room at ease, whether it's virtual or real one. I have to use slides. I'm a consultant. I'm not great at making slides, hand on heart. But I often try to use slides they're just there, and then we're going to talk about stuff that actually we sort of care about, and then we can share the details thereafter. But the value in any of those sessions that we ever have is in that conversation, that interaction. It's about, have we got something out of the time that we've spent together? That's something that you don't just achieve on day one. You have to establish that. And I think as those of us who have presented on stage here, if you think back to the first time you presented on stage, I'm imagining you were probably a bit of a nervous wreck. Maybe you felt like you hadn't yet found your style, and how maybe you best would be doing those things. Maybe you didn't get to click slides. Maybe like me, one of your first presentations was when your demo completely failed. But you get there, don't you? Like practice, it's just putting yourself out there and sort of running with it. And I think if you can find what it is that you're comfortable in doing, then others who you're presenting with will also feel that.
Yeah.
And I think it depends totally on, actually say, who you're presenting to. Because as I said, as I've presented many meetings before and various things as a group lead and a line manager, but my first conference speech was very different. I was far more prepared. And actually, before I did it, I did write out sort of bullet points on post-it notes in order to just to satisfy my own brain. But as soon as I started, I knew it. It was inbuilt because I'd written the talk, so therefore I knew what the context for each thing. So actually, I didn't need those notes, but it was sort of a fail safe just in case everything went wrong. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Things will go wrong, as Chris says. Sometimes demos don't work. Sometimes technology lets you down. That's why I'm saying, if you keep control of it, then you have the narrative. And if it doesn't work, then although it may be on your computer, you should potentially know enough in order to sort of ad lib and change it. Don't be too put out by things going wrong, because things go wrong for everybody at some point in their presentations. And it's how you handle those that actually makes you grow as a presenter, because you can sort of ad lib, you can cope with it. It may be memorable for the wrong reasons, but actually you can actually grow from it and learn a lot from those.
It's sometimes useful to pre-prepare yourself for worst case scenario. Worst case scenario, the projector stops. What do I do? Well, if it comes to it, I can. So I was lucky enough to see a presentation by Catherine Kirk about teams being humans and how you should innovate with that rather than relying on team structure being kind of rigid. But she did the entire talk on cards. She had words and diagrams on cards, and she just went in front of her. So if the worst comes to the worst, have it as a backup that you can say, well, I can dash off a few cards that'll illustrate my points. And if I need to stand up there with cards, I can just do that. It does take a little bit of, I suppose, guts to get up on stage and do that, but it's all kind of performance. I suppose my experience probably not the same as a lot of other people's, in that my first time presenting on stage wasn't my first time on stage. So I had been in dramatic presentations in college, and I had also played live music on stage. So being in front of people doing bizarre creative things was not unusual to me. So I know kind of there's a common denominator of just standing up and even just making people laugh will get you through to an extent, but also the ability to ad lib, the ability to kind of riff on a topic and just to, I suppose, entertain to an extent. While that may be challenging for conveying the point that you're trying to do, you usually find your way through if you have that background. But it's kind of a different beast. Going back to what Chris said, the first time I presented, it was like a different experience. So, but I suppose it did help me as well to have that kind of experience to fall back on.
A little bit interesting because talk about failing and things like that. You just remember me the first time I kind of did a meetup. I was trying to get people involved in helping create like framework for testing for syllabus for helping coach and mentor. Set up a meetup, had about 8 or 9 people kind of agreed to come along and all the rest of it. Went to it, no one turned up by myself. Now that was my first experience. It didn't stop me. I learned a lot. I learned that the worst thing that could happen is I could do this by myself. So I had to choose whether I want to continue by myself or not. Ended up with lots of people getting involved, but it's interesting that learning about failing, things go wrong. I've never been married, but I've been to lots of weddings. And one thing I've learned about being in lots of weddings is something always goes wrong on the most important day of everyone's life. And they still have the most important, of generally happiest day of their life, even with some major catastrophe going on behind the scenes, the catering dropping the cake or someone being violently sick early on across the wedding dresses. There's all sorts of random stuff that happened at weddings, but the show must go on. The show does generally go on. And it's about that working through the problems.
And you have a minimum thing to do. So in a wedding,
Yeah.
if at the end of the day the two people are married, that's a success.
Exactly. And same with the presentation. If you can
Yeah.
get your point across, doesn't matter how, your slide deck may die, it may end up being the wrong version, lights may go out, you may do it in the car park. But if you get your information across, that's success. The how part, be it a slide, be it a video that you're showing that doesn't have the sound on, all these little things that try you in presentations ain't the end of the world.
Mm-hmm.
If you can style it out, it's fine, if that makes sense. If you can't style out, it's still fine.
And actually, this is really important. Is we talked about preparation, PowerPoint preparation and stuff. You really highlight a good point, Russell. Is what is the key point that you want to get across? Because what might happen, and it's happened to me in company meetings or whatever, or department meetings, is that your time gradually goes from, okay, you've got 10 minutes. Okay, you've now got 5 minutes. Okay, you've got 2 minutes. You ditch the slide deck and you just need to go, right, okay, I need to give this information to these people, and this is why it's important. Make sure you have in your mind what the key information is so that you can then share that.
Absolutely. So the equivalent of the two people being married in that context is getting that key point across by hook or by crook. And if it's on the last slide and you have to skip some slides before the time's up, by all means. And everyone will understand. Like if you have to hit escape and stop this wonderful presentation and go find the slide and bring it up, they'll be more appreciative to get your point rather than having to go, no, it's not, next, no, it's no, not this one. Hang on, I got this.
Another thing I would say, and I've learned this from having edited this, is silence. Silence is golden in a presentation. You don't need to fill the time with just spouting all the time, because people then have to fit in, oh my god, what's the important bit from all the, where's the needle in the haystack of all this fluff that you're telling us? And also bit of silence, rather than trying to do ums and ahs, actually gives people space to consider what you've spoken about, what you've thought about. It doesn't mean to say you've finished, but actually it allows them time to reflect on that. And therefore they're not listening to the and the and catching up. It is literally just giving them space to think.
You're giving them space just reminded me of something, which is questions. We've talked obviously a lot about the presenter presenting things, but one of the things that happens with be it a kind of a corporate style presentation, be it a workshop that you do, whatever way you're presenting, there is generally questions. And there's questions from that you can either do at the end, do during, depending on the sort of style of talk that you want to do. But I find it's very, very interesting because I've also seen a kind of some questions that just there are no questions. You see a lot of places where someone presents something and there's 0 questions afterwards, and they see that as success, that they got the information across perfectly. No one has any questions. I aced that. My experience tells me if you get no questions, you've probably lost your audience somewhere. It's not that you're perfect, it's that something disengaged them probably in the process. I must admit, I struggle when I'm the receiver of a presentation because often I'll have questions during, and my brain moves to the next question, moves to the next question. I lose track. I generally don't write them down. Sometimes I do. Some of the Teams meetings we have these days and things like that allows you to use the chat quite well, that you can actually ask questions at the relevant time. You can raise your hand in meetings and people that are presenters can see if there's there. And the other one, I kind of going on to kind of virtual talks now a little bit, is actually cameras. You can see if you lose people or not if you've got your camera on. I appreciate in a room of 5, 10, you can. If you're doing a presentation to 300 people, everyone with a camera on doesn't really make huge worlds of difference to you. But having some people with camera on to see whether you've got some attention, certainly in smaller groups, is an incredibly useful, powerful, because your body language is almost one of the best bits of feedback, and it helps you understand and adapt how you're presenting.
It helps you as a presenter as well, doesn't it? If you actually have people that are there sort of supporting and nodding along. I understand your point. At Eurostar last year, at the beginning of my talk, I invited as many people as possible to come closer so I could actually see them, because I find it easier to do that. And when I've done remote calls, I've always invited people, if comfortable, to have their camera on, to butt in and chat and ask questions, use the hands up tool, whatever the thing you're doing, because interactivity is really important, because that turns something that's almost a broadcast into something that's valuable to that context. And that interaction helps change something that maybe you're just trying to get done to get it done, sort of check a box off or something, into something that's actually a valuable point that then helps the attendees to apply what you've talked about into their own context and start to sort of see how that story that you've been telling, because ultimately a lot of our role in testing is telling stories, whether that's stories of risk, of quality, of customers. That sort of ability to make a story that you're telling relevant to your audience is really important. The more we can do as attendees of talks to make it relevant to our own context, whether that's asking the question then and there, or whether that's speaking to the speaker afterwards, asking about those points and go, oh, it's really interesting. You know, that's quite valuable, isn't it?
I suppose it depends, though, if your style is more akin to The Princess Bride than On the Road. It takes a certain personality to stand up on a stage and convey a point and be open to the kind of digressions that come out of a question in the middle, and then be able to come back to the flow and be confident enough that you're going to get to the point by the end.
You can set that context at the beginning, though, right?
Yeah.
I think the best meetings I ever attend are the ones that there are sort of rules of engagement agreed upon at the start. And so if someone is going to be presenting and they are comfortable for people to butt in and do things, they can tell you. Otherwise, you say there'll be questions at the end or whatever. We've got this long. That sort of thing helps establish expectations, which are so important in any sort of. It's always uncomfortable when people butt in and stuff. I was at a one conference where they experimented with these cue cards where people could literally interrupt you in the middle of a session with like a red card, and they were empowered at any point to debate with you on what you were talking about. That's a horrific experience for speakers and massively makes it about the person that's suddenly the attendee. That's not my kind of jam. Do you know, like if you establish those rules of engagement, like this is the way we're going to run it, it's different, and that shows the value in agendas in meetings and how we set things up to run. You know, in this talk today, we're going to be talking about blah blah blah. You know, I think that's really important, because I quite often, especially in remote meetings, am very quickly switched off unless I know what to expect. I can appreciate this is going to be something that is applicable to me and I can run with it. And the person doesn't have to be Mr. Charisma. They don't have to have the most shiny, wonderful slides in the world. I don't care about that. I care about the message, the value, and what it means, and where I fit with it.
The story and the conversation.
Selfish little me thing,
Yeah.
but it's what do I get out of this time? What do I understand? What do I learn? How does that sort of work? And I think that's really important.
And like a good question from the audience can enhance the entire session, you know?
On the other
Like
hand,
you
it can destroy the whole session as well.
Sure.
Yeah.
One thing I was going to say was, again, it goes back to if you're less experienced in presenting, as Chris said, put the context in early.
Mhm.
If you don't feel comfortable with people interrupting you, then say, I will take questions at the end. Because if you don't set that context, then you're opening yourself up to allow them to ask questions in the middle. So make sure you do set that context if you're not happy with that particular.
And
It's
if you
a-
forget to,
Yeah.
and somebody asks the question, you just say, oh, we're going to do questions at the end. So
Yes.
I see your question and we're going to come back to it at the end.
And then follow through that
Mm.
they ask a question. And so go back to them. Remember those
'Cause
things.
If you're less confident in those things, run throughs with people, talking through with people. If it's in a work context, have someone that's sort of advocating for you, talk you through what they walk you through, how it's going to be, and be there alongside you. And that's the value of sort of good track chairs or hosts or MCs in those bits who can help sort of manage expectations. If you're not very comfortable with those things, you'll have someone who's there to help moderate on your behalf. Moderators are often the heroes of sessions that
Yep.
you have. They can help make or break stuff getting out of hand or not. And that in and of itself is an incredible art.
Another thing about questions is, again, it goes back to one of the previous questions of planning ahead and thinking about the worst case scenarios type thing. If you think about what questions may be asked and the most tricky questions, then you can potentially answer those in your presentation. So therefore, you're sort of heading off those people that might be a bit argumentative by trying to give the answer first of all.
There's another trick around that, which is don't answer them in your presentation, but be prepared for them.
Yes.
So that when it comes along, you've got the answer. Because no matter what you do in your presentation, some people will always be tricky questioners. So you can help yourself by preparing for them, especially if you've done the presentation multiple times. You know the sort of questions that might come up. So you can either adapt your presentation, that's certainly valid, or you can kind of have prepared answers to one of a better degree.
It could be a negative spiral though. Like if you start thinking of everything that can go wrong, all of the questions, you start
Never ending,
deviating.
isn't it?
I once had this genius idea when I was a gymnast, and I thought everything that could go wrong with a balance or a move or a transition, there'd be a recovery that we could plan so it didn't look like we'd really made a mistake. Oh, I've fallen over here, but actually I can do a little thing here and then move on. But actually, in a sort of 1.5 minute, 2 minute routine, it becomes an infinite number of possibilities of where things could go wrong. Then you start to forget about what it is, what we're trying to achieve, and how I can get back on track on those things. And sometimes the recovery might not be elegant, but if you get back on track to that core message, that core thing that you're trying to achieve, that is ultimately the thing that your goal of your session should be. And hopefully that's the memorable thing, and you can sort of move on from the mistakes rather than focusing on everything that could go wrong and how I might mitigate it. Not to say that you shouldn't think about those things, but it can be quite a negative spiral that then deviates away from what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, that's fair.
We do kind of thrive on the feedback from the audience, whether it's virtual or in person. But you mentioned before about no questions. That can bring the mood down significantly. In the past, I haven't been above inventing questions. What often happens is people don't ask questions because maybe they don't feel safe to ask questions. So if you say, we have a question from John, John's asking, how did I do this with the toolkit that I was using? And the answer is very simply using XYZ. By doing that, you kind of open up the floor. You say, well, John asked a question. I think I'll ask a question and somebody will jump on. So you can kind of make it a bit more welcoming for an audience who maybe hasn't really stepped out of their comfort zone in terms of interacting on a talk or webinar or presentation or whatever.
So we've done a lot of sort of talking about, I guess, a slide presentation. Have we ever got much experience of any other kind of style of presentation, like more workshop-y presentation sort of style or more abstract? I'm just curious.
I've seen a talk done by a chap who didn't have any slides and he just told a story. And his story is his lived experiences, and it was compelling. He was a born storyteller, and it's that what a gift he had. He didn't need slides. Everyone was quiet. Everyone listened through to those things, and he had a whole pile of those things. He didn't do anything special. He just told his story, and he didn't need anything supplemental to that. Now, that's not at all abstract, but when you think about when you're shaping a slide in the story you're telling, we use the tools that we can to help embellish the stories that we're telling as best that will work for us. And I've seen people do sort of dramatizations. Friend of the podcast, Sam Nietzsche, does some amazing songs with Lena Nystrom and others. Incredible characters that they sort of bring out. That's a beautiful thing, because if I saw only the same kind of presentation that was always in the same tone, in the same style, with the same kind of flavor to beginning, end, and so on and so forth, man, would that be boring.
Absolutely. In the last year, I had to reframe what I had originally thought to be an in-person slide-based talk into an on-demand video. It was fun in parts, and it was a stretch, though. It was a lot of hard work. I'm not sure if I have them by the end, because it was just rapid learning and just-in-time Googling for a lot of the things. But the people, for example, the informational YouTube channels that I follow, my hat goes off to them for being able to present in that sort of multi-video sort of way. And it ceases to be about the presenter to an extent, because you have to move away from there being a person in front of you to there being something illustrating and there's a voice behind. So it's a very different paradigm. I think I prefer presenting in person, but it was a very interesting and educational experience just to be on the kind of creation side of that rather than just consuming it.
I think I've seen some people do kind of tricks, and as you say, talking about it, using something as almost a distraction, a visual cue, for want of a better word, but isn't a slide, just to talk around something, or use props in order to kind of keep active. So they're not like standing behind a lectern sort of thing, but they're actually walking around stage doing something and trying to relate back how we can be deceived, and that sort of sleight of hand and how that kind of affects us. It was all about sort of cognitive biases, how they did them, and they were using magic tricks to demonstrate how easy it is for our brains to be tricked just by misdirection, for want of a better word. So that was quite an interesting one. But yeah, there was no slides. It was definitely just verbal. And I guess sometimes we see a lot of TED Talks. A lot of those are deck-free, if that makes sense. Certainly some of the ones I've seen. So actually you don't need a slide deck to get your message across necessarily quite well. But it certainly, I find them quite useful as cues. Perhaps that's more the approach that a lot of people seem to take these days in general. Well, that seems like a fantastic place to end today. So why don't we wrap up there? Thank you for joining us. Thank you for talking about presentations. Thank you for talking, I guess, for want of a better word. We've been the Testing Peers. Thank you for joining us. If you want to listen back to more, we've got a back catalogue of 100 or so episodes now, but you can also reach out to us at contact us at testingpeers.com. And if you're interested in conferences and events and other things, there'll be the Testing Peers Conference in Nottingham in March 25. And you can find more about that at testingpeerscon.com. So feel free to do that. And thank you again for the Testing Peers for joining us. Thank you, Dermot. Thank you, David. Thank you, Chris.
For now, it's goodbye from the Testing Peers.
Goodbye.
Bye.